Good afternoon. Welcome to the Solar Market Pathways webinar. My name is Sarah Baldwin-Ock with IREC, and I am joined today by John Cheneau of the Regulatory Assistance Project, with whom I co-facilitate the Solar Market Pathways Community Solar Affinity Group, which is kind of the origin for this conversation today, but we have expanded the group beyond our core affinity group and invited others to join us. So thank you so much for everybody taking some time out of your busy schedules to participate in this webinar and this conversation today. Before I get going and introduce our panelists, I want to make a few housekeeping notes. So the webinar dashboard is up in your right-hand corner. You can use that little control red arrow to close and open it. We ask that folks, you will all be muted, but we ask that you try and use your telephone mainly so that there's not weird feedback. In the off chance that we have a small enough group to unmute and have folks just weigh in with questions at the end, we will absolutely do that. Want to kind of see how big this group gets before we decide to do that. But for questions that come up during the presentations and or after during the Q&A session, please use the little questions section to type in any questions or comments that you have, and then use the chat window below only for any technical issues. For example, if you're having any trouble hearing anybody right now, now would be a good time to let us know using the chat feature. And then we are recording this, and we will provide a link to the recording and the slides after the webinar. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and dive on in, and I'm going to present, or introduce rather, our first presenter, Janine Mignon Ostrander. She is a principal at the Regulatory Assistance Project, and she has a lengthy resume and rich history working on a number of energy regulatory issues, and most significantly and relevant to this conversation, her time for a number of years spent as the Ohio Consumers Council, overseeing the agency that represents Ohio's 4.5 million residential households with respect to the investor-owned utilities there. And she has done a number of other things, and I'm not going to review all of those things. It would take me too long, and I want to make sure we have time for questions at the end. So with that, I'm going to turn the time over to Janine and let her take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. You can go to the next slide. So just a couple of seconds on the Regulatory Assistance Project. We are a global nonprofit organization that advises governments and regulators on economic and environmentally sustainable policies with a focus on lowering our carbon footprint. Next slide. Next slide. Next. So the topics we're going to cover today are, go back one, please. Topics we're going to cover today include a general overview talking about consumers, net metering and distributed generation compensation issues, the convergence of rate design and revenues, access to solar distributed generation for low-income customers, and a few customer concerns regarding grid modernization. Next. Next. So we're going to start with the general overview. So some things you may want to know about consumer advocates. There are approximately 45 states that have a statutory consumer advocacy agency. Most of them are independent state agencies. Some are parts of Attorney General's offices, commission offices, or governor's office. Most of them represent just residential customers, but some do represent commercial and or industrial customers. There are other interveners and organizations that participate in commission proceedings like legal aids or public interest groups that focus on low-income issues. And they all routinely intervene. For more information, I've included the website for NASUCA, which is the which is like the consumer advocate equivalent of NARUC. And you'll see the list of members plus associate members as well, to give you a breadth of the consumer advocacy community. Next slide, please. So some facts on low-income customers. Approximately one-third of residential customers struggle with affordability. 67% of seniors on Social Security rely on it as their only source of income. In Ohio in 2011, and I think the figures probably haven't changed if I were to update them for this year, but that was the last year that I was Consumers Counsel and tracked this. Approximately 450,000 customers lost electric or gas service because of non-payment, and that's 1 in 10 households. The other fact to keep in mind is that Ohio has one of the best low-income payment assistance programs in the country, and yet these are our numbers. Low-income customers are often forced to choose between food, medicine, rent, and utilities usually fall on the bottom of the heap until they're threatened with disconnection. There is a much higher energy burden for low-income customers who spend approximately 15 to 20% of their income on energy bills as compared to the national average of 2 to 3%. So if you take your paycheck and figure that you were spending 15 to 20% on energy, think about what a cut that would make in your income. And sadly, among a bunch of other cuts that President Trump is proposing is a complete cut of LIHEAP, which is the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, which provides currently $3.37 billion, which is allocated to the states to assist customers with energy bill payments. While it is not expected that it will completely be cut, it is expected that it will nevertheless have a significant cut in total funding, which is going to further exacerbate the problem. Next slide. So what's on the horizon? We have customer empowerment issues, new technologies, and competitive service offerings. And as a result, this leads to utility sales reductions and hence lower revenues for the utilities that they want to make up somehow. And that results in questions about shifting responsibility for rate recovery and also equity issues. And this again is pitted against a public interest in a low carbon energy future and also grid resilience becoming an increasingly important issue in light of severe climate or climate change. Next slide, please. So the goal is to find a balance to protect all customers with the goals of fairness, equity, and adherence to public policy objectives. Next. So consumer advocates represent both DG and non-DG customers, meaning distributed generation customers. And right now, DG customers represent a small fraction of the entire customer base. And so the attention of consumer advocates are going to be focused more on those customers that are non-DG because that's the majority of their customers. And also there's always a tendency to advocate more for the underdogs, which are the low-income consumers. But nevertheless, there is an attempt to try to find some sort of fairness and balance. And as the number of DG customers grow, the issues around that are going to grow, but also the concern of representing those customers as well will grow. Next slide, please. So what are some of the consumer concerns? They are concerned about the reduction in sales and revenues, thereby increasing non-DG rates. And keep in mind, the utilities have done a fairly good job of representing DG as the haves versus the have-nots, low-income customers subsidizing these rich people's, toys. And so that's, so that's an argument that needs to be dispelled, and the value back to the grid needs to be demonstrated. But there is generally a belief among a lot of consumer advocates that net metering results in non-DG customers subsidizing DG customers, that the full retail rate paid back to DG customers is greater than the avoided cost. And part of this comes from a net meter rate that includes transmission and distribution and also other surcharges. There's also a belief that DG customers are using the grid, so if they're using the grid to sell power back, they should be charged for it and pay a fee for it. There's concerns about the impact of all of this on the low income, which we've been talking about, and also what opportunities they have to participate in this. So Fair access to energy services and resources is very, and full information are very important issues to consumer advocates. Next, please. So we're going to talk a bit about net metering and DG compensation. Next, please. Traditional rate making would have the utility average cost of service equaling the retail rates. Next. Next, please. And some low-income advocates of net metering, solar advocates of net metering, view that the lost revenues from net metering are not as significant as the long-run avoided cost for generation, transmission, distribution, reduced emissions, avoided fuel costs, avoided fuel risk, local and economic development issues, and carbon costs, etc. Next slide. Okay, I think there was a slide that got skipped, but anyway, so the balance is utility average cost of service. That what you want to do is have the utility average cost of service equal all of these long-run avoided costs that we just previously listed. Next slide. So here's where we get into the convergence of rate design. Next, please. So consumer issues in rate design include allocation of costs to the cost causers, sensitivity to rate impacts for those engaged in distributed generation versus those that are not engaged in distributed generation, and finding the right balance there. And finally, the biggest issue for consumer is the attention to affordability. What do all these changes mean for the average customer and low-income customers' electric bill? Next, please. So RAP did a study called Smart Rates for a Smart Future, which is available on our website, in which we tried to come up with principles that balance the issues that we've just been discussing as best as possible. And so if we go to the next slide, I'm going to walk you through the three principles. Next, please. So the first principle is that a customer should be allowed to connect to the grid for no more than the cost of connecting to the grid. So if there's a service drop to the pole, from the DG to the pole, then that would be something that would be added that the customer would pay for. Otherwise, that would be it. Next slide, please. Customers should pay for the grid in proportion to, next, there's a picture that should come up. Next again. Customers should pay for the grid in proportion to how much they use the grid and when they use it. So in this example, you see a mansion plus a small apartment, and the mansion obviously is using a lot more than the small apartment, and rates ought to reflect that. Next slide, please. You're going to click 3 times. Okay. Customers should pay for the grid. Again, on this principle, you have a refrigerator that's running 24/7, and it's a pretty steady load that the utility can count on. But during high peak periods, you might have the air conditioner running, or you may have a car charging at various times of the day, and that's going to impact how the grid is used. And for that reason, it may make sense to take a look at time of use rates that can clearly capture those price signals for what is it costing the utility system. Next slide. So principle 3 is customers delivering power to the grid should receive full and fair value, no more and no less. And that's just a fairness issue. Next slide, please. And we kind of believe that net metering is sort of rough justice for what that value is. However, in states that have exceedingly high rates, something less than net metering may make sense because it might overcompensate the DG customer at the expense of others. Whereas by the same token, if there are very low rates, the DG customer may not be adequately compensated for the rates being, for the energy being provided to the system. But on a general basis, net metering does represent sort of a rough justice way of doing it. But another way to do it is through a rate design like this, which has a billing and collection cost known as your customer charge for $4, a transformer demand charge applicable to DG customers of $1 per kVA, which would roughly be somewhere between $3 and $4 a month added to the customer bill. And then the supply cost would be bidirectional for off-peak, mid-peak, on-peak, and critical peak periods, so that if a DG is delivering power at on-peak time, it's going to get 15 cents. If it's off-peak, it's only going to get 7 cents. By the same token, as that customer draws from the system, they're going to pay in accordance with these same rates based upon whether it's on-peak or off-peak. And that's, I think, can go a long ways towards addressing some of the concerns of consumer advocates about subsidies, because the DG customer is paying and being compensated in relation to the cost of the system. Next slide, please. So options to address lost revenues: decoupling, straight fixed variable, and demand charges. Next slide. I'm going to talk about each of those briefly. So decoupling is designed to break the link between sales and revenues. And in a decoupling mechanism, the Commission basically determines in a rate case what the revenue requirements are. And at the end of an authorized period, the Commission will true up the difference between the authorized revenues and the actual revenues the utility received. And it can result in either a surcharge on the customer's bill, or it can result in a refund on a customer's bill. Typically these run, next slide please. Typically these run in the 1 to 2% range, plus or minus, but more likely it's a cost to the consumer than it is a credit. But there are significant examples of credits. So how this works: you have target revenues of $10 million based on a Commission decision. The test year sales are 100 million, so you have a 10 cents per kWh charge. And so then at the end of a post rate case calculation, a period of a year, it could be done monthly, it could be done semi-annually. Mostly it's done annually. You would take a look at the actual sales, which were reduced by 500,000 to 99,500,000. And so there would be a requirement to increase the rate by a small fraction with a decoupling price adjustment, which would allow the utility to recover those lost revenues. Next slide. Next, okay. So concerns with decoupling include, there's a mixed customer reaction. Some consumers like it. I liked it when I was and supported it when I was the Consumers Council. But there are a number of consumer advocates, more probably than less, that do not support decoupling because of various concerns. The big benefit in terms of decoupling, from my perspective, is that whatever the Commission says, at the end of the day, you go into a rate case, you fight like, as best you can to get the rates down. But whatever that revenue requirement is, it is. And any over-recovery, for the first time, there's an opportunity for customers to see what the utility is over-earning and to actually have that money flow back to customers. When you hear utilities say, I haven't been in for a rate case for 10 years, it's because they've been over-recovering for 10 years. This finally gives the money back to customers. And there's a lot more I can say on that if there was more time, but I'll keep moving. Detractors are concerned that it changes the regulatory paradigm from one in which the utility is given an opportunity to earn a return, a certain level of revenues, to one that it guarantees it. And as a result, they're concerned that the utility may have less incentive to operate efficiently. And there's some papers on decoupling that RAP has done, in which, in our most recent one, I addressed that issue at length. The third issue is that decoupling is still a volumetric charge. So still, those customers who use distributed energy resources are going to still be using less kWh, and so they're going to pay less of the adjustment. Next slide. Next slide, please. So straight fixed variable would allocate the distribution system costs all to the customers as being customer related. Next slide. It would, what it does is it allows the utility to recover the amount through a fixed monthly charge. It does address the issue of separating sales from revenues, the throughput incentive. but it reduces the volumetric component of rates to just fuel or short-run marginal costs. Consumer groups do not like or support straight fixed variable, and in fact are very closely aligned with the clean energy community in opposition to this, and have worked together in a number of proceedings to fight this. Next slide, please. Other considerations is that it results in low-use customers subsidizing high-use customers, which often means that low-income customers are subsidizing the wealthy, which is not the way we want to see things work. It also does not promote conservation, and it increases the payback on energy efficiency investments. Next slide, please. This just basically shows you how straight fixed variable rates can eat up the energy efficiency or other savings to the grid, because under an all-you-can-eat kind of rate, consumption generally is expected to go up about 5%, which drastically reduces all the savings from an energy efficiency program. Next slide, please. Demand charges are emerging as the utility substitute for straight fixed variable, because the utilities are not uniformly having success with that, although they are in a few places. Demand charges are also very unpopular with consumer and clean energy groups. What it does is it penalizes a customer for their maximum usage at a particular time of the day, even though that particular time of usage may not coincide to when the utility is experiencing a peak period. For example, in the morning, everybody's getting up, getting ready for school, getting ready for work. Toasters are going, coffee makers, hair dryers, electric razors, the works, the showers. And so the demand is very high, but it's an off-peak period, and yet the customer will be penalized. It's much better to do a time-of-use rate that correlates utility cost with customer usage. Next slide, please. So access to solar distributed generation for low-income customers. Next. There are shared renewables, which I suspect a lot of you on the call know a lot about, so I just have a few slides on this. But shared renewable programs facilitate individual ownership shares of common renewable energy facility. Next slide. And customers would enter into an agreement with a shared renewable facility and pay a subscription price. The SRF would then sell the energy and RECs to the utility, and the utility provides a kWh credit on the customer's bill to offset its load through a virtual metering arrangement. Next slide. Consumer perspectives on shared renewables. It does present an opportunity for low-income and apartment dwellers to participate. Working out details to finance and landlord ownership are of paramount importance and need quite a bit of attention. But despite the fact that there's been a lot of talk about shared renewables, there is still a certain amount of skepticism in the low-income community that it's not going to have the breadth to provide services to a large group of customers. So it's sort of one of those things where the jury is out. The idea is good, but the jury is out. Let's see what happens for low income. There's a need for consumer protections from scams. And those customers that are not reached by shared renewables are still going to have the same problems and concerns that were discussed above. Next slide, please. So low-income customer, another option that RAP is working on is to create a checkoff on DG customer bills to donate all or a portion of the kWh sold into the grid to low-income customers. So the way it would work is the utility would aggregate and convert the kWh sold. So a customer who has a DG facility could have a checkoff that says, I want to donate 100% of the power I sell to the grid, 50% or 0 or whatever percentages. And whatever that is, the utility would aggregate it and provide a dollar credit. And in this example, we use community action agencies because they have certified the eligibility of low-income customers. They're the ones who are implementing the LIHEAP program we talked about earlier, and it would just be an additional sum of money added on to their LIHEAP for them to use and administer as needed. In states with RPS, the utility could also purchase the RECs, and that value would go back to the community action agencies as well. Next slide. So here's a sample calculation I did of what would be the impact, taking a look at taking a look at what, how much DG is sold back to the utility, what their price is, etc. And you can see the numbers here that they range from 62,000 in Vermont, which is a small state, to as much as over 3.3 million in Maryland. All of these states, with the exception of Georgia, have a renewable portfolio standard that would add to the cost, the benefit. And we calculate that overall, if this was done on a nationwide basis, with everybody giving their KWH back, 100% volunteerism, you could end up with very roughly, back of the envelope, 75,000 customers being helped in a year. Next slide, please. So finally, I'm going to conclude with a couple of quick comments on grid modernization. I was asked to address that because of its importance with respect to renewable energy. The biggest number one question is, how much is this going to cost? We have so many customers struggling. Can we afford to pay it? And what are the benefits versus the costs? And consumers want to make sure that the benefits are netted against system costs included in rate base. So for example, if a utility says, well, this is going to save me $70 million in cost for doing X, Y, Z, then we want to either see that, consumer advocates either want to see that credited against the total bill for the grid modernization, or go back into the rates and reduce the rates to reflect that the utility no longer has this cost, so that rates go down. Another big question, and I think a lot of folks are concerned about this, is will the technologies that you paid for last their useful life, or will they become obsolete? Will you end up with a stranded cost? What is the ability to upgrade existing new technologies so that they can withstand upgrades and changes in other technologies that they interface with? And then, a basic question that I hear from a lot of consumer advocates is, look, are low-income customers even going to take advantage of the benefits? Are they paying us for something that has no value for them? Aunt Edna, who's 80 years old, living in her own in a little apartment, she doesn't care about any of this. So why should she pay for it? And finally, there is a concern among customers that they will be forced onto time of use rates, which low-income advocates believe will harm stay-at-home households. There have been 2 studies, Oklahoma Gas and Electric and SMUD, that have shown savings for low-income customers, but those are only, savings for all customers, but the low-income savings were less than for other customers. We need more studies and more examples of this to try to create a opt-in program, and that's another subject that I could go into a lot of detail with, but I'm going to conclude right here, and thank you all for your patience and attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Janine. Excellent presentation, and really appreciate all the information as well as the food for thought for future discussions. So I'm not seeing any questions come in the question box, but if you do have any immediate questions for clarification for Janine, feel free to pop them in there. But I think in the interest of time, I do want to get us going on our next presenter. And again, we'll have opportunities for questions and answers at the end. So I'm pleased to introduce Jackie Patterson. She's the director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program, and much like Janine, brings a rich and long history of engagement on a number of topics, both energy and environmental, as well as social justice. And she is doing a lot of excellent work over at the NAACP, and she's going to talk with us about some of that activity in her presentation. So Jackie, are you queued up and ready to go?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Wonderful. Yep, can hear you loud and clear.
Okay.
So I'll let you take it away. Thanks.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So thanks everyone for being interested in this topic, and thank you to IREC for organizing this conversation. And so with my brief remarks, I'm going to kind of pan us back to talking about why it's important for us to pave these accessible pathways to solar access, particularly for low-income communities and communities of color, why it is that we need to make this transition in general as a nation and as a world, and then a little bit more back down into some of the pragmatics of equity issues in making sure that there is access as we make this advancement, and that there aren't any unintended consequences that negatively impact, but that really the communities of color and low-income communities are able to enjoy the bounty of benefits of this transition. So we're going to kind of go through a lot of slides very quickly. And so in terms of the overview, I'll talk a little bit about the challenges of the fossil fuel-based energy production in terms of who pays the price. What is the current economic relationship between low-income communities and communities of color in our current energy economy? What are some of the existing policy constraints, even as we try to advance this emerging new energy economy, in ways that we can remedy those? What are some explicit ways that we can integrate economic justice principles, practices, and mechanisms? And then what are we already beginning to see in terms of successful partnerships and frontline community leadership around this, so that it's not another industry that happens to communities, but that communities are actually not just at the table, but they're actually helping to drive decision-making. And then just wrapping up with some promising models for equitable clean energy access. So next slide, and next slide. And so what we see now is, as we know with the fossil fuel-based energy production, we have everything from the 76,000 coal miners who have died of black lung disease from 1968 while we've been producing the bulk of our energy from coal, to even as we look at a new energy economy, a lot of folks are trying to produce the same amount of energy as cheaply as possible. So they're looking at natural gas, which is contaminating our water supplies and having other negative impacts. And then we see, next slide, the impacts of how we produce energy on a body in terms of the air pollution that gets into our lungs, the water pollution that gets into our bodies, the soil contamination that we end up ingesting even as we try to do good, sustainable things like creating community gardens, and all of those health impacts that are disproportionately borne by communities of color and low-income communities who are more likely to host energy production processes in the fossil fuel economy. Next slide. And then we also see the connection between socioeconomic issues for communities. So we have children who are having these negative health impacts, which then leads to educational impacts, which then leads to other social impacts. So just as taking an example of this one young man, Antoine, who lives in Indiantown, Florida, 2 miles away from a coal-fired power plant, has severe asthma and relies on these medicines to get from day to day. His parents sent me this picture of him looking on as a child was playing on in the water, and they feel like that's emblematic of his life, looking on, whether it's other children playing or looking out the window as other kids go to school while he can't go to school like other kids because of his asthma condition. And African Americans 68% of African Americans live within the zone of impact of a coal-fired power plant, and African American children are 3 to 5 times more likely to enter to the hospital from an asthma attack and 3 times more likely to die of an asthma attack. And Antoine is emblematic of that situation of the impacts of asthma in one's life. So we have kids who are less likely to go to school because of poor air quality days. They're in school having a hard time paying attention because lead and other metals are another thing that comes out of those smokestacks, which also impacts learning. And then on top of that, if you're living next to or nearby a toxic facility, your property values are on average 15% lower, and property values are what finance our school systems. Then we have under-resourced schools on top of kids having a hard time paying to school or having a hard time going to school. And for us, we know the studies show that if you're not on grade level by the 3rd grade, you're more likely to enter into the school-to-prison pipeline. So we see all of these socioeconomic educational issues as being inextricably connected, and that compels us to see energy energy as a civil rights issue, as an equity issue that needs our concentrated effort to make sure that we make this transition and that we make it in an equitable fashion. Next slide. And so as we see this transition, another reason for this transition is that we know that climate change is also a consequence of our dependence on fossil fuel-based energy production. And again, communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. Even though disasters happen where they happen, they don't discriminate. The impacts do because of the pre-existing vulnerabilities and conditions, and even the post-disaster context where the communities of color and low-income communities are more likely to not be able to recover at the rate of other folks because they don't have that cushion to be able to build back up, whether it's savings or whether it's the political decision making that often governs where resources go in the post-disaster context. Next slide. So when we talk about our current energy sector, next slide. These numbers represent the current relationship between African Americans and our energy sector now. $6 billion is the approximate annual revenue from the energy sector. $41 billion is how much African Americans on average spend in energy costs every year. 1.1% is the percentage of African Americans in energy jobs, and less than 0.1% is the amount of revenue from the energy sector that comes back into the wallets of African Americans. So this is just as an example, and a similar statistics for Latino Americans, and even worse for Indigenous Americans or Native Americans. And so we have this dynamic of an industry that's extracting from our communities to the tune of billions of dollars. We don't have the jobs and we don't have the revenue that comes back for, and so it's someone's profiting from not only our income, but also profiting from what's polluting our communities, profiting from pollution, because they choose to they're trying to make the most money, so they put it in a place where it's going to cost them the least amount of money to operate, and they get the least amount of resistance, and we end up paying the price. And so, next slide. And this is, well, next slide. And so then on top of that, we see this, that on top of spending $41 billion on energy, we actually pay a higher proportion of our income on energy use, not just in terms of lower income, but across all the income levels, and are more likely to be in need of LIHEAP assistance, which is a low-income heating and energy assistance program. Next slide. And this is just a snapshot of folks who have had their energy shut off just in 2008. We recently did a report called Lights Out in the Cold, Reforming Utility Shutoff Policies as if Human Rights Matter, which looks deeply at the negative impacts of electricity shutoffs on communities of color and low-income communities, elderly folks, and so forth. Next slide. This is just the Energy Affordability Index to look at across the country, the states that pay the most proportion of their incomes towards their energy costs. And as we see, it's highly concentrated in the South in terms of the places that pay the highest proportion of their incomes towards electricity. And just as one example, in Mississippi, where we're doing work with the rural electric co-ops, there's places in Mississippi where people are paying upwards of 37% of their income on energy. And so these high costs of energy for folks means is yet another compelling reason for us to make this transition. Next slide. And so as we turn towards what we consider to be energy democracy and equity-based solutions, we have a number of different ways that we are seeing the challenges of being able to access even the new energy economy. Next slide. And so our overarching goal is to ensure that vulnerable communities and households can access efficient and affordable electricity as we traverse the clean energy, this can transition to a new clean energy economy. Next slide. And so we want to make sure that because we saw the inequities in the old energy economy, not just in pollution, but even economically and otherwise, we want to make sure that we're being very explicit and intentional in making sure that folks have access in this new energy economy, and that folks are able to access also the jobs and the ownership stake in the new energy economy, so they are seeing revenue even from the new energy economy. Next slide. And so that even as we've started to roll out clean energy policies, some of the challenges include the fact that they're often for individual homeowners, and the benefits come through tax credits. And so that excludes a good chunk of our population. Next slide. And so we really, so next slide. This is a lot of this information comes from the Center for Social Inclusion and their work on energy democracy, I should say. And so another challenge is the lack of access to technical assistance for supporting community-based endeavors in the low-income communities and communities of color. But fortunately, we're seeing a change in that. The Sunshot Initiative, the Solar in Your Community Initiative, we're seeing an uptick in this. But as it was beginning to roll out, we saw that a lot of the early takers were folks who were already in the industry or already understood these things, and so it was harder for communities of color and low-income communities to really be able to benefit. Next slide. We also see the production tax credit again is something that's focused on homeowners, which shuts out 25% of white Americans and 50% of African Americans and Latino Americans, who are renters and so forth. Next slide. And so we really want to focus on making sure that the production tax credit also supports community scales projects as well as homeowners. Next slide. And so even with net metering, some of the barriers in certain states is where they are capping the limits. They have the low limits in terms of the systems, and so that makes it hard for community-scale solar to be able to benefit from the net metering policies, because it's capped at the household level. It's capped so that people can't really generate that much more than they're using. And so we want to make sure that there is the removal of those caps, are very liberal caps, and that there's good possibilities for community choice as well, and the ability to have net aggregation. Next slide. And so, one of the groups we work with is Fifth Group Technologies, and that's Robert Wallace on the right side, who's with Fifth Group Technologies. And so we want to make sure that there's equitable access for small scale produce of clean energy. And so these are just like small mechanisms that I'm sure many of you already know about. Next slide. And then we have some of the issues that I think Janine already touched on in terms of the fixed charge issues, and so I won't go over those again. But some of the ways that these fixed charges differentially negatively impact communities of color and low-income communities, although a lot of times folks will couch them as being specifically to benefit communities of color and low-income communities, because they'll claim that they're a way of removing what they'll term as a subsidy for the rich. And so it's a way of kind of balancing those scales, as what folks who are trying to use the equity frame to drive a false narrative around this. Next slide. And so next slide. And so these are some of the promising model solutions in order to make sure that there are access routes for all. So on-bill financing, some of the pay-as-you-save models, making sure that there's aggregation and collective purchasing, availability, and consumer choice. Really working with the rural electric co-ops, making sure that folks know that they have an ownership stake in their rural electric co-ops, and that they're more engaged in the decision-making, so that some of them are also moving towards clean energy. Supporting cooperatives in general around clean energy, and similarly solar and wind gardens. Next slide. and then just really engaging consumers in policy making and decision making, whether it's rural electric co-op boards, public service commissions, public utilities commissions. Next slide. And so this is just our campaign, the Just Energy campaign, unlocking clean energy to power and empower our communities. Next slide. And so these are the pillars of our energy democracy agenda: energy efficiency resource standards, renewable portfolio standards, distributed generation, net metering, community ownership of energy and asset development, and then making sure that economic justice is part of it, as well as political power building. Next slide. And so, like I said, our local hire provisions are included. Next slide. Disadvantaged business enterprise provisions for minority and women-owned businesses, so that there's explicit ways that these groups can be a part of the new energy economy. Next slide. And again, community asset development. And so these are some of the folks that we're opposing this push and well-financed opposition against this direction we want to go in, and really targeting, going after the National Hispanic Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus, National Policy Alliance, National Black Caucus of state legislatures, et cetera. Next slide. And this is one of the model resolutions against net metering that they managed to get passed and ratify with the National Policy Alliance, which is an African-American think tank collaborative. Next slide. And this is just some of the reasons that that they're so easy to drive a wedge between these communities. And I'm going to kind of go quickly through the rest because the slide transition situation has made this go a lot slower than ideal. Next slide. And next slide. And then so these are some of the, again, just some of the ways we already talked about in terms of why we are in support of distributed generation and net metering, in terms of encouraging energy efficiency because people know that they're going to get money back on their bills, supports the transition to clean energy, obviously. It's opportunity for communities to be a stakeholder, an actual owner in the new energy economy, and it decentralizes profits of the energy sector, whereas currently a lot of folks use the energy sector, the profits, to actually push back against the regulations that we need to push back against policies that support this transition. Next slide. And this is just some of the work that we've done on this, whether it's pushing back on fixed charges in Indiana. Next slide. And pushing back on some of the dirty energy in Mississippi, pushing forward on clean energy also in Mississippi and Gulfport. Next slide. Pushing forward on energy efficiency policies and clean energy policies in Missouri. Next slide. This is just an example of a Missouri Republican who cited the NAACP as one of the reasons that he became a green champion. Next slide. And then just some of the work where in different places we've been releasing our Just Energy policy reports with this agenda, including those policy pillars I mentioned. Next slide. And in Michigan, the release of the Just Energy policies report with those same policy pillars. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, so these are just our campaign values: well-being of communities, including safety and health, economic opportunity, true democracy. Next slide. And just our transition goals. Next slide. And some of the promising practices, including frontline community leadership. Next slide. Yep, our goals again. Next slide. And really, really pushing to make sure that there are diversity in all rooms where this is being discussed. This is the energy efficiency room where myself and another guy out of over 100 people were the only people of color in the room. Next slide. And this is something I put in as a bit of humor because once I went to a meeting and it was of regulatory attorneys, and when I walked in, the person who was, kind of receiving folks thought I had to have been in the wrong room, and I later saw why, because literally I was the only person of color in the entire room. Next slide. So just reinforcing the ways that we need to have successful partnerships. Relationships need to be real relationships, not just transactional. There needs to be leadership, not just engagement, not just sitting at the table, but being a part of decision making. We have to have holistic, systemic strategies that include all these different things I talked about in terms of education, political power building, economic justice, et cetera, and really making sure that we're showing real and tangible risks and benefits for low-income communities and communities of color. So that kind of brings us to 20 minutes. I'm sure other things might come up in the Q&A. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jackie. And you do have a lot to talk about, and there is so much to cover in this topic. It clearly could be a webinar series in and of itself, but want to thank you both for your presentations, and I want to invite folks at this point to submit some questions. And I see a couple already from Brett Pence of Equilibrium, and I'll just read them aloud. His first question is for Janine, wanting Janine to comment on the inclining block rates as a tool for just rates and decoupling, and whether or not you have thoughts on that.
Declining block rates, just so everybody knows what that is, that's where the first block is a higher price, and the more you use as you go into subsequent blocks, the rate goes down. For example.
Hey, Janine, sorry, he asked about inclining block rates.
Oh, I thought you said declining. I'm sorry. Okay.
Big difference.
Declining's not the answer. Inclining is. So inclining block rates can be a helpful tool because the rate goes up the more you use. So the first block, if you have a low use rate of, let's say, 500 kWh, that can help customers who are low use never having to pay the higher rate because they never get to the higher levels of demand or usage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is with regard to decoupling. Tucson, Arizona, a long time ago did this experiment, put in place a rate whereby if under a decoupling mechanism there was a refund back to customers, the refund went on that first block. So low usage customers got, and all customers as a matter of fact, got the benefit of that refund. However, if it was a surcharge, it went on the second block. So customers who were using more electricity, the high-use customers, would pay a higher amount. So that's a way to couple inclining block rates with decoupling.
He had a follow-up question about the relationship between the perceived need by investor-owned utilities for a high return on investment as a driver of IOU rate policy.
Could you repeat that, please? I didn't quite catch that.
Sure. It says, could you comment on the relationship between the perceived need by the investor-owned utilities for a high return on investment, or excuse me, an ROE, not I, return on equity, as a driver of their rate policies?
Yeah, I mean, the utility companies, one of the things that you see sometimes happening with the decoupling mechanism is that some consumer advocates will argue to reduce the return on equity because you've reduced the risk to the utility since its revenues are going to be guaranteed. But one of the concerns about that is that the rating agencies like Standard & Poor's have acknowledged that the decoupling is a factor that contributes to a higher rating for the utility because there is less risk, and the higher rating translates into lower interest charges. So when the utility has to borrow and it's going to recover the cost of its borrowing plus the interest from consumers, I think consumers ultimately don't end up being ahead of the game by arguing for a lower return on equity. And parties can vary about what is a reasonable return on equity, but that's basically that issue with respect to decoupling. So you want to make sure the utility is healthy, but not too healthy at customers' expense, so that the interest rates and cost of borrowing do not go up, because customers will pay that as it's a pass-through.
Great. Thank you. I have a question for Jackie from Diana Chase. She says, Jackie, can you say more about the relationships not just being transactional, and do you see that as a moral issue or a more pragmatic issue? In other words, are communities less responsive to the transactional approaches?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think that what we're finding is that communities don't like, even when, so for example, we've had some experiences with solar companies where they'll come, and we can actually make available, hopefully, this document we've put together on ways that solar companies can work with communities of color and low-income communities to advance an equity agenda that is mutually beneficial, and it lays out some specifics around it. But we've had in the past companies that will come to us and they'll say that they want to work together mutually, but then we, for example, have laid out those examples of the ways that we can work together and the things that we can do jointly, and that would both increase business for the solar company, that would help to improve their workforce, and that would also bring equity and access to communities, and would help to have jobs for those communities, et cetera. But then instead of prioritizing and responding to and helping to pave pathways for those ways to work together, we only hear from the company, just speaking of one particular, when there's some net metering struggle that's happening in some place, and they'll call us up to ask us to weigh into this net metering struggle, but they won't prioritize having a conversation about a more fulsome relationship that includes a number of different ways that we can work together. And just also want to clarify, in this particular example, this was in no way a financial relationship. We weren't asking for any type of financial, because that's often what people default to, assuming that it's about that. But literally, that wasn't even on the table in any way, and not now, or something that we were hoping for later. It was just all about how we can, how we can work together to make sure that folks know what the opportunities are in training, what the opportunities are in jobs, what the opportunities are in vendorship, how we can work together to do outreach so that communities know what the possibilities are for engaging. So instead of helping to push on that, and then that would actually make stronger champions at this community level, because people see the tangible ways that they can benefit from being engaged. They only want to reach out when their bottom line is being threatened by these different policies, whether it's the fixed charge policies or so forth. So hopefully that gives sense. But again, we can make that document available that kind of lays out some of the ways that communities would like to be in relationship with solar companies.
That would be excellent, and we'll happy to circulate that. If you want to share that with me, Jackie, I can circulate that with the group. Had another question and request for you, Jackie, to return to a slide. I will try and find it, but basically going back to the slide about why it's been so easy to drive a wedge between various groups, and talk us through that slide a little bit more, and I'm going to try and find it quickly, but
okay,
I'll let you go ahead.
Okay, yeah, if I can remember what's on it, it'll be good. But, right, thank you. Oh, there we go. I think we went past it. We were there.
Yeah.
Okay, there we are. Okay, good. Thank you. So one is that often it's communities that are already, and so one of the things is that these companies do get the relationships need to be more than just transactional, and they've been very intentional about building relationships over time, relationships so that then when they are under fire, then they actually will able to mobilize. They'll be able to mobilize communities, because the communities feel like they've invested in them over time, and not just financially, but being on they've made sure that community members, like the prominent leaders in communities, are on their board, and they've gotten themselves. They go to the community meetings and they join the community groups, and then they end up on the board, the leadership of these groups. They part of it is sponsoring things and those kind of things, but again, those relationships they've really built over time, and so that's probably, I would say, the hugest thing. The other thing is the extent that there is in some cases, these financial relationships as well. And so if you have an overburdened community, and I can think of many, and you have these companies that have really set themselves as friends to these communities, for them, part of that definition of friends is that they will, give sponsorships and scholarships for kids in schools. One of the NAACP units once came to us and said, so in overburdened communities, if someone is being a friend in different ways, including helping to deal with, what's often grinding poverty in these communities, then it's easier to then have those communities champion the causes of these different entities. And so one community I was working in, they actually wrote to the NAACP National and said, this company wants to build a landfill in our community, but they said that they really want to be a partner with the community, and that they are offering to pay $10,000 in scholarships every year for the next 10 years. And so they were just thinking, well, this is a new business coming into the community, and this is a gesture of goodwill. But in fact, what was clear is that they also wanted them to support their permit for building this landfill, which was going to be sited on top of an aquifer. But because this community is an overburdened community and their kids are having a hard time in school, and the notion of the scholarship that came with this notion of friendship as a new player in the community was a welcome thing. So that both that overburdened community and the concrete benefits of partnerships for distressed communities is something that these fossil fuel companies have really been able to play on. And then on the other side, being able to do the fear-mongering in these already insecure circumstances. So we have communities like Detroit where people where there's a high level of those shutoffs, whether it's water shutoffs or electricity shutoffs. When you have when we were doing the 25 by 25 campaign for the Renewable Portfolio Standards, and you had a DTE that was, and Consumers Energy that were running these ads that showed that had kind of a ticker showing how much your energy bills are going to go up if you signed onto this policy. And so that coupled with the fact that they had been, quote unquote, a friend to the community over the years, and now they're telling them that their rates are going to go up, and that just the notion of that happening was enough to make them not want to do something what they considered to be just kind of a exploratory risk in terms of buying into the 25 by 25, and they don't see the benefits of movement of clean energy or renewable energy for their community. They only see a risk for that. And then again, the lack of proactive information sharing and education on counter-arguments. So communities aren't inoculated against these things. So the notion of the bills going up fell on fertile ground because there had been really no good advanced work done with communities saying, this is what 25 by 25 is, this is what the benefits of renewable energy, these are the concrete benefits for your household if we transition to clean energy. No one had really done that work, so it was easy to spread fear in an absence of information, and information that's done in an accessible way. That's why you'll see on the document about ways that we can really co-educate as frontline community groups, co-educate communities so they actually know what the benefits are for this transition to the new energy economy. And again, just wrapping up on that, and it's kind of it feeds into the others, is this energy advocates and solar companies' low prioritization of engaging with the leadership of the most impacted communities. So just really coming to these groups last, and then again coming to them in these very transactional ways that doesn't build relationships, doesn't build trust, and therefore doesn't build buy-in. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Jackie, and that's very helpful.
Thank you.
Additional information. I'm glad we were able to walk through that slide a little bit more. Any other folks who have questions? I'm not seeing any come through, and I have one, so if nobody has one, I will ask it. And it's actually a question that sort of harkens back to our original motivation for reaching out to both of you ladies. Wonder if you can both provide some brief insights on, you've both kind of touched on effective strategies to yield a more productive conversation on energy equity between industry and advocates and decision makers. But if you were to reflect on, one sort of priority area of focus or strategy on that front, what would it be, and where would you see the opportunity to make the most progress? And I'll maybe start with Janine, since Jackie just had 2 back-to-backs.
Thank you.
That's kind of a tough question. I think the first thing is that low-income consumer advocates and clean energy advocates need to engage more in a conversation, and they need to build up more trust. I hear frequently comments from consumer groups that a clean energy environmental group came in, got a settlement, got what they wanted, and walked out, and the consumers are paying the bill. And so there needs to be an opportunity for, or there needs to be outreach between the two groups to sit down and say, where are there areas where we can agree, and how do we make these things work? And areas of agreement could be on how do you allocate costs, what is an appropriate rate design, dealing with issues of time of use rates in a way that's sensitive to low income, consumer group concerns, dealing with, in terms of education and shadow billing. There are so many avenues and so many places where if the communities would come together in a particular case and work together to find solutions and not let the utilities do a divide and conquer kind of strategy. I think that would be where I would start, is just a common understanding and then digging deeper into each issue.
Great. Thank you. Excellent insights there. Jackie, any thoughts from you?
Yes, thank you. I would say that really having a broader conversation about let's see, because communities are concerned about the negative consequences of making this transition, there needs to be a deeper discussion about the direct and indirect positive reasons for making this transition, and like a deeper, and then there needs to be conversations not just with, for example, energy advocates, but with other groups, whether it's housing groups or welfare rights organizations, like all the folks that deal with the communities that are most vulnerable to kind of the fear-mongering around the negative impacts, and therefore more likely to mobilize against this because of a notion of a negative impact. So there needs to be that conversation, not just so that they're not fighting against it, but also so that this is an equitable move, and that there are benefits that are felt by those communities. So I'm not articulating it very well, but as such, I mean. So there needs to be, so the point being, for example, right now I'm at this meeting of the Network for Energy, Water, Health, and Affordable Buildings. And so because it recognizes that all of these different actors are critical to the energy conversations, and that they're understanding the constituents in different ways that will help us to see how, because all of these things are interconnected, and that part of our problem has been operating in these silos. So that's one thing. And then relatedly, having groups that are having folks who are, so I really want to emphasize that it's not just income, it's also race as it relates to, because there is a meme that, solar is for white people, and it's not just like a cultural meme, but it's also, it also implies like rich white people, but it also gives a sense of that no one's really made this accessible for our communities, and therefore it's not something and so it must be something that's part of this historical pattern of regressive policy making, regressive programming, where certain communities bear the negative brunt and other communities benefit. And since this is a historical pattern, there has to be that level of intentionality around having conversations with constituency groups that can help to frame this and to organize this in a way where the access pathways are very clear and the benefits are very clear. Sorry, I know that was garbled. Hopefully you got some sense out of it.
No, that all made sense for sure. And
okay,
I agree.
Yeah.
There are so many moving parts, and the breaking down of silos is a constant battle within so many spheres, but the energy sphere in particular seems to struggle with that pretty profoundly. Despite the fact that energy is connected to everything, we tend to want to segregate it. So, well, great. Well, I think we are close to wrapping up here. I do want to, there's one more quick question from Ida Smith, so I will ask it, and then we'll use that to wrap up. And the question might be bigger than we have time for, but I'll cue it up. What drives the just transition agenda, energy access or energy ownership? And how important is ownership for consumers if consumers can access affordable, reliable, and clean energy, perhaps without owning it?
Yeah, that's a very critical question. I'm so glad you asked that. So, because that is a very important distinction and one that's often lost. With even some of the groups that are advancing this transition, they figure, well, if it's if it's utility-owned energy, isn't the point just to make this transition and to do it in a way that's equitable and accessible? But we feel like that nuance is there because, in terms of ownership, because of what I was saying before in terms of those co-benefits, and that, and then up until now, and to really, so for one thing, up until now, as I said in that graph, that even groups that are accessing energy, they are accessing energy while also being the ones who are disproportionately burdened with the pollution. And then, so on one hand, it might be something where they're able to kind of eke out enough of income to be able to pay for their energy, but yet they're also experiencing all of these other negative impacts that makes life more difficult in other ways, as I illustrated before. And so when we talk about making this transition, we're also integrating specifically economic justice aims so that we're kind of in those scales in some ways, in terms of not just kind of having this continue to be an extractive relationship in terms of revenue, that people are actually benefiting from the energy economy. That also increases buy-in, because if people are feeling like, well, this is not only something where we're getting cleaner air, cleaner water, and so forth, but we actually have an economic stake in this, that actually increases buy-in. And then also, because of the past with the way that our very revenues have been used to push back against regulations by these same utilities that would be proposed to be the utility owners of the utility-owned clean energy structure. These are the same utilities that took those profits from, the folks who barely had the money to pay for their energy bills, and then used it to suppress regulations on pollution from these energy production plants. And so that had that negative impact on those communities. So it's really redressing this history of pollution that people have had at the hands of these very utilities. So the notion of having those very utilities again in the driver's seat for the new energy economy is not something that sits well with folks in the equity and justice space. Again, I know that was garbled, but hopefully that makes some sense in terms of the distinction. So both the economic justice aims is redressing the history and really pushing for a shifting of political power as it relates to this new energy economy. And a decentralized political power that really that's why we talk about energy democracy. Is part of a political system that's been dominated by people who have had the most money, and they've taken that money from our pockets. We want to decentralize our power so that we're all equally participating in decision making around a new energy economy and otherwise.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, Jackie. Thank you, Janine. With that, we are at the time allotted for this webinar, so I'm going to go ahead and wrap up. Thanks to everybody who joined us today and for the great questions, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. Let us commit to not making this the one and only time that this group connects. I think there's a lot of great synergies and opportunities for expanding that relationship. So let us go forth and build it. With that, thanks so much, and we'll call it a wrap.
Thank you.